Welcome. This is Mr. Perry, and welcome to the continuation of the Supreme Court Justice series. Our case today, Mr. S has a good one for you. Plessy versus Ferguson. A little context on what the political and social arena was at that time. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed slavery and made black citizens of the U.S. That was followed shortly thereafter by the 14th Amendment, which in short gave all Americans equal protection under the law. Now, the U.S. went through a painful period after the Civil War called Reconstruction, where the country attempted to right some of the wrongs brought about by slavery. In many cases, it just didn't work, and the period gave way to the so-called Jim Crow era. This was an era which was defined by laws that segregated blacks and whites, particularly in the southern states. Now, this particular case was centered in Louisiana, which had a large Creole or mixed population, so there was some tension between the races. Our petitioner was Homer Adolph Plessy, and the respondent was John Ferguson. The case happened and was argued on April 13th, 1896, and decided May 18, 1896. Let's look at the facts of the case. Now, Louisiana enacted the Separate Car Act, which required separate railway cars for blacks and whites, and in 1892, Homer Plessy, who was 7/8 Caucasian, agreed to participate in a test to challenge the act. He was solicited by the Committee of Citizens, which was a civil rights organization at that time, a group of New Orleans residents who sought to repeal the act. They asked Plessy, who was technically black under Louisiana law, to sit in a whites-only car of a Louisiana train. You may ask, what constitutes a person being 7/8 white? Well, if you look at the grandparents and the great-grandparents, which produces 8 individuals, one of those 8 individuals was black. The railroad cooperated because it thought the act imposed unnecessary costs via the purchase of additional railroad cars. So when Plessy was told to vacate the whites-only car, he refused and was arrested. At trial, Plessy's lawyers argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendments. The judge, who was Ferguson, a state judge, found that the Louisiana could enforce this law insofar as it affected railroads within its boundaries. Plessy was convicted. So the question became, does the Separate Car Act violate the 14th Amendment? And Mr. Plessy took his case out of Louisiana State Court and into the Supreme Court. And what was the conclusion? Well, by a 7-1 decision for Ferguson, it was a majority opinion, and it was read by Henry B. Brown. It said, equal but separate accommodations for whites and blacks imposed by Louisiana do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court held that the state law was constitutional. In an opinion authored by Justice Billings Brown, the majority upheld state-imposed racial segregation. Justice Brown conceded that the 14th Amendment intended to establish absolute equality for the races before the law, but held that separate treatment did not imply the inferiority of African Americans. The court noted that there was not a meaningful difference in quality between the white and black railway cars. In short, segregation did not in itself constitute unlawful discrimination. In dissent, one individual who did not agree with the decision, John Marshall Harlan, argued that the Constitution was colorblind and that the U.S. had no class system. Accordingly, all citizens should have equal access to civil rights. This created or helped to create the doctrine of separate but equal, in that the courts said that as long as things were equal, then you could make it separate. So that applied to schools, it applied to lunch counters, it applied to everything in society. So we have a lot of facts. This is a landmark case. Take these facts, answer those questions from Mr. S, and hit it and quit it. Let's get it done.